The town of Silver Hollow was known for its peaceful winters, where snow blanketed the streets and the sound of carolers filled the crisp December air. Nestled between rolling hills and an evergreen forest, the town seemed like the perfect place to celebrate Christmas. But beneath its charming facade, Silver Hollow hid a dark secret, a shadow that returned every Christmas Eve. The story began decades ago with a man named Gerald Forrester, a recluse who lived in a cabin deep within the woods. Gerald had been a toymaker, crafting beautiful wooden figures that the townsfolk would eagerly buy for their children. But one Christmas, a tragic fire consumed his home, taking his life and his creations. Rumors began to swirl that Gerald's spirit lingered, seeking revenge for the loss of his craft and the indifference of the townsfolk. Every year after Gerald's death, strange events occurred on Christmas Eve. Families reported hearing faint tapping on their windows, even on the upper floors of their homes. Others claimed to see a shadowy figure standing at the edge of the forest, watching the town in silence. The stories were dismissed as folklore, a tale to keep children entertained or fearful enough to behave. But one Christmas Eve, the McAllister family experienced the legend firsthand. Having recently moved to Silver Hollow, they were unaware of the town's dark history. Their cozy home sat near the forest's edge, with a large fireplace they had eagerly decorated with stockings and garlands. As the snow fell heavily that evening, the McAllisters gathered around the fire. The warmth of the flames and the glow of the Christmas tree filled the room with comfort. Their young daughter, Lily, was particularly excited, hanging a plate of cookies for Santa on the mantel. At precisely midnight, the tapping began. It was faint at first, almost rhythmic, as if someone were lightly rapping on the windows. Mr. McAllister, thinking it might be a branch swaying in the wind, went to investigate. But when he looked outside, he saw only his own reflection in the frosted glass. The tapping grew louder, and the family began to feel uneasy. Lily clung to her mother, her small hand trembling. "It's just the wind," Mrs. McAllister reassured her, though her voice wavered. Suddenly, the fireplace roared, the flames shooting up as if stoked by an unseen hand. The garlands hanging above the mantel fell, igniting briefly before extinguishing. The room plunged into an unnatural cold, and the tapping ceased, replaced by a faint whispering. The voices seemed to echo from the walls themselves, growing louder until they formed words. "Leave the forest, undisturbed." Mr. McAllister grabbed a flashlight and opened the front door, determined to put an end to the unsettling noises. Snowflakes swirled in the air, and the forest loomed ominously in the distance. He saw nothing at first, but then his beam of light caught movement among the trees. A tall shadow shifted, disappearing deeper into the woods. Despite his wife's protests, he ventured out, the crunch of snow under his boots the only sound accompanying him. The forest seemed alive, the trees creaking and groaning as if whispering secrets. The deeper he went, the darker it became, until the beam of his flashlight barely illuminated the path ahead. Meanwhile, back in the house, the whispers grew louder. Mrs. McAllister tried to comfort Lily, but her own fear was evident. The Christmas lights on the tree flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. One shadow, larger than the others, began to move independently, stretching toward the fireplace. Lily pointed at it, her voice barely a whisper. "It's him," she said, tears streaming down her cheeks. Mrs. McAllister pulled her closer, unsure of what to do. The shadow grew, taking on a humanoid form with elongated limbs and hollow eyes. It stood still, watching them, before raising a hand to point toward the forest. At that moment, Mr. McAllister stumbled back into the house, pale and shaking. "We need to leave," he said, his voice trembling. "Now." The family hurried to their car, the shadow's gaze following them as they drove away. As they passed the edge of the forest, the shadow dissolved into the trees, leaving only an eerie silence behind. The McAllisters never returned to Silver Hollow, and their story became another chapter in the town's dark legend. Locals avoided the forest entirely, especially on Christmas Eve, when the shadow of Gerald Forrester was said to walk among the trees, watching, waiting, and ensuring that no one disturbed his eternal rest. Over the years, the town's population dwindled, and Silver Hollow became little more than a ghost town. But travelers passing through on snowy December nights sometimes report hearing faint tapping on their car windows or seeing a shadowy figure standing just beyond the tree line, reminding them that some spirits never truly rest.